The stars had always seemed distant and cold to humanity. But on that autumn morning when the alien vessels pierced through Earth's atmosphere like burning daggers, everyone understood that the universe was far more dangerous than any telescope had ever revealed. In the observation tower of the Global Defense Initiative, Colonel Rachel Brennan stood frozen, watching the crimson streaks multiply across her monitors. Her coffee cup trembled in her hand, the liquid inside creating tiny waves that mirrored the chaos about to descend upon her world. Beside her, Lieutenant James Hawthorne frantically worked his console, his fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed impossible readings. These ships were massive, each one the size of a small city, and they moved with a grace that defied their enormous bulk. The young officer's voice cracked as he spoke, betraying the fear that gripped his chest. "Colonel, we're detecting energy signatures beyond anything in our database. These readings suggest weapons capable of cracking continents." Rachel set down her cup with deliberate care, a gesture of control in a moment spiraling toward madness. She had served in the military for 23 years, had seen conflicts across 3 continents, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. The aliens, later designated as the Korvath Collective, had arrived without warning, without negotiation, without mercy. Their intent became clear within the first 60 seconds when their ships opened fire on the International Space Station, vaporizing humanity's greatest achievement in orbit with casual indifference. Across the planet, in the underground research facility known as Site Omega, Dr. Benjamin Torres rushed through corridors that hummed with sudden activity. His lab coat flapped behind him like wings as he ran, clutching a data tablet that contained years of theoretical work he prayed would never need practical application. Benjamin was a physicist, a man who lived in equations and hypotheticals, but today his theories about quantum manipulation and gravitational shielding were about to become humanity's desperate lifeline. His research partner, Professor Yuki Tanaka, met him at the entrance to the main laboratory, her face pale but determined. Together they had spent 15 years developing defensive technologies based on captured alien artifacts from the Roswell incident, objects the world believed were hoaxes. The truth had always been far stranger and more terrifying. Those fragments of crashed technology had taught humanity one crucial lesson: we were not alone, and we were not safe. Meanwhile, in the skies above New York City, Captain Robert Kane pulled his fighter jet into a sharp climb, his squadron following in tight formation. The Korvath ships hung in the atmosphere like dark omens, their hulls reflecting sunlight in shades of deep purple and black. Robert had logged over 3,000 flight hours, had trained for every possible combat scenario, but as his targeting computer struggled to lock onto the alien vessels, he felt the cold touch of inadequacy. His missiles, his guns, everything humanity had built for warfare suddenly seemed like children's toys against these technological leviathans. The Korvath opened fire first, sending beams of concentrated energy that turned the morning sky into sheets of burning light. Cities along the eastern seaboard vanished under the assault. Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore disappeared in seconds, replaced by craters that glowed with residual heat. The death toll climbed into the millions before the first hour ended, and still the alien ships advanced, methodical and merciless in their destruction. In Geneva, inside the fortified bunker that housed the emergency session of the World Council, President Catherine Voss listened to reports streaming in from every corner of the globe. Tokyo under siege, London burning, Sydney evacuated. The list of catastrophes grew longer with each passing moment, and with it the weight of impossible decisions. Catherine had been elected on promises of peace and prosperity, but now she faced the potential extinction of her species. Her hand hovered over the authorization codes for humanity's most dangerous weapons, nuclear arsenals that had been kept as deterrents, never meant for actual use. But would nuclear weapons even work against shields that could absorb gigawatt laser strikes? Would conventional warfare mean anything against beings who had crossed the vast emptiness between stars? These questions haunted her as military advisors shouted conflicting strategies, as scientists proposed desperate theories. As the world looked to her for salvation she could not guarantee. Back at Site Omega, Benjamin and Yuki worked with frantic precision, activating systems that had existed only as blueprints until this moment. The quantum shield generators, massive devices that covered an area of 50 acres underground, began to hum with power drawn from experimental fusion reactors. The theory was sound, at least on paper. By manipulating quantum fields, they could create a defensive barrier that would redirect energy rather than absorb it, potentially protecting entire cities from orbital bombardment. Power levels at 40%, Yuki called out, her eyes scanning readouts that climbed steadily toward operational threshold. If this works, we can extend protection to a radius of 200 kilometers. If it fails, we might trigger a quantum cascade that collapses the entire facility into a singularity. Benjamin nodded grimly. Then we better not fail. His hands moved across the control interface, making minute adjustments to field harmonics. Outside, above ground, the Korvath ships continued their advance, unaware that beneath the soil, humanity was preparing to unveil secrets kept hidden for decades, technologies born from necessity and nurtured by fear. Colonel Brennan watched her screens as global defense forces mobilized. Every nation had contributed to the response, putting aside old grievances in the face of existential threat. Fighter jets from 50 countries filled the skies, forming a desperate wall of metal and courage against the alien advance. She saw them engage the Korvath escort craft, smaller ships that separated from the main vessels like angry wasps. The battle was joined, and humanity discovered something crucial in those first terrible exchanges. They could fight back. Human missiles, when fired in sufficient numbers, could overwhelm alien point defense systems. Railgun strikes from experimental weapons platforms could penetrate Korvath shields if concentrated properly. The aliens were advanced, yes, but they were not invincible. This revelation spread through military channels like electricity, transforming despair into determined rage. Humanity had always been at its most dangerous when cornered, and now the corner had become the entire planet. The second day of the invasion dawned over a transformed world, where smoke columns rose like dark pillars connecting Earth to heaven, marking the graves of fallen cities. Colonel Rachel Brennan had not slept, her eyes red-rimmed and burning as she coordinated defense efforts across 3 continents. The observation tower had become a war room, filled with voices speaking dozens of languages, united by a single desperate purpose. On her main display, the Korvath fleet had settled into orbital positions, their ships forming a blockade that turned Earth into a prison. Lieutenant Hawthorne brought her the latest casualty estimates, and Rachel felt her stomach twist. 50 million dead in the first wave, with projections climbing higher as infrastructure collapsed in the devastated regions. But beneath the horror, something unexpected emerged. The human military had adapted with frightening speed, learning the rhythms of Korvath attack patterns, identifying weaknesses in their ship formations. Evolution through necessity, survival through innovation, these had always been humanity's greatest strengths. In the skies above what remained of Tokyo, Captain Robert Kane led his squadron through a deadly dance with Korvath fighter craft. The alien ships were faster, their weapons more powerful, but they flew with a mechanical precision that Robert had learned to predict. He rolled his jet beneath a plasma burst that would have vaporized his cockpit, then fired a spread of missiles that his targeting computer insisted had 0 probability of hitting. The missiles struck home and another alien craft spiraled toward Earth, trailing purple fire. "This is Falcon Leader to all wings," Robert transmitted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "They compensate for logical attack vectors but struggle with unpredictable maneuvers. Fly crazy, fly random, make them guess." His words spread through the global defense network, a tactical insight born from desperation. Pilots worldwide began incorporating erratic patterns into their engagements, and slowly, incrementally, the tide in the air battles began to shift. Deep inside Omega, Dr. Benjamin Torres stood before a screen showing the successful activation of the quantum shield. The device had worked beyond his most optimistic projections, creating a shimmering dome of distorted space that covered the entire western seaboard of North America. Korvath bombardment beams struck the shield and simply ceased to exist, their energy scattered across dimensional boundaries humans barely understood. But Benjamin knew this victory came with a terrible price. Professor Yuki Tanaka worked beside him, her face grave as she monitored power consumption rates. "The fusion reactors are operating at maximum capacity, Ben. We can maintain the shield for 72 hours, maybe 96 if we're lucky. After that, we either find another power source or the shield collapses." She paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "And if it collapses catastrophically, the quantum backlash could sterilize everything within 500 kilometers." Benjamin nodded slowly, calculating probabilities in his head. 3 days to find a solution. 3 days to turn experimental science into reliable defense. 3 days before millions of people sheltering under the shield would be exposed to alien fury once more. He thought of his daughter, safe in an underground bunker in Colorado, and wondered if he would ever see her graduate from high school. The weight of responsibility felt like a physical thing pressing down on his shoulders. In Geneva, President Catherine Voss faced an emergency council session via holographic projection, world leaders appearing around the circular table like ghosts. The Chinese premier spoke first, his voice carrying exhaustion that matched her own. Our forces in the Pacific Theater have successfully destroyed 3 Korvath capital ships, using coordinated nuclear strikes. The cost was severe. The fallout will poison those waters for generations. But it proves these invaders can be killed. Catherine absorbed this information, balancing the tactical victory against the environmental catastrophe. Nuclear weapons worked, but at what cost? The Russian president added his report, detailing a ground assault by Korvath infantry in Siberia, where human soldiers discovered the aliens were vulnerable to conventional arms at close range. Their personal shields could stop energy weapons but struggled against old-fashioned bullets and explosives. Humanity's supposedly primitive kinetic weapons had become unexpected advantages. But the most surprising news came from Dr. Helen Okonkwo in Nairobi, broadcasting from an intact research center. Her team had been studying the wreckage of a downed Korvath fighter, and what they discovered changed everything. Madam President, the aliens are not invincible and they are not infinite. Our analysis suggests their fleet represents perhaps 70% of their total military capacity. They committed heavily to this invasion, expecting quick victory. If we can hold out, if we can inflict enough damage, they may be forced to withdraw. Catherine felt something stir in her chest. Something she had not allowed herself to feel since the crimson dawn of invasion. Hope, fragile and dangerous, but undeniably present. Then we make them pay for every meter of ground, every moment they remain in our system. We show them that conquering Earth means bleeding for it. Across the planet, this message resonated. In the ruins of Mumbai, soldiers fought house to house against Korvath ground troops, learning that the aliens relied heavily on their technology and panicked when separated from their equipment. In the Amazon rainforest, indigenous communities used guerrilla tactics perfected over centuries to harass alien supply lines. In the Arctic, research teams discovered that Korvath machinery struggled in extreme cold, providing yet another advantage to defending forces. Colonel Brennan coordinated a massive counteroffensive, pulling together every available asset for a simultaneous strike against the Korvath orbital blockade. Satellites equipped with kinetic weapons, fighter wings armed with experimental warheads, even civilian spacecraft retrofitted with mining explosives, all converged on a weak point in the alien formation. The attack lasted 47 minutes and cost humanity dearly, but when it ended, a gap existed in the blockade wide enough for relief supplies to reach isolated regions. Captain Kane participated in that offensive, his squadron diving through a storm of plasma fire that turned space itself into a killing field. He watched good pilots die, saw ships explode in silence against the void, but he also saw Korvath vessels rupture and drift, saw alien fighters tumble away trailing atmosphere. The battle was brutal and ugly, but it was a battle humanity was learning to fight. In Site Omega, Benjamin made a breakthrough that would change the course of the war. While analyzing Korvath energy signatures, he noticed harmonics that matched frequencies in the quantum shield. Yuki, what if we're not just defending? What if we can weaponize the quantum field generators? His partner stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. By inverting the field parameters, they could create not shields but quantum disruption waves that would tear apart any technology dependent on stable spacetime geometry. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Such a weapon could devastate the Korvath fleet, but it could also cause unpredictable damage to Earth's own systems. Yuki pulled up simulation after simulation, each showing different outcomes ranging from complete success to planetary catastrophe. We need time to test this properly, Ben. We need to understand the full consequences. We don't have time, Benjamin replied quietly. We have 3 days before the shields fail and millions die. Sometimes you have to gamble everything on an untested theory. He thought again of his daughter. Of all the children sheltering in bunkers, waiting to see if adults could save them from monsters that came from the stars. The third day brought a silence more terrible than any bombardment, a pause in the violence that felt like the universe holding its breath. Colonel Rachel Brennan stood at her observation post watching the Korvath fleet regroup in high orbit, their damaged vessels pulling back while fresh reinforcements moved forward. She had been awake for 68 hours, sustained by coffee and the knowledge that millions depended on decisions she made in her exhausted state. But as dawn light touched her face through the reinforced windows, Rachel felt something shift inside her, a resolve that went beyond duty or survival. Lieutenant Hawthorne approached with tablet in hand, but this time his expression carried something other than fear. "Colonel, we're receiving reports from defense forces worldwide. Morale is holding. Soldiers are calling this the long stand and they're ready to fight for however long it takes." He paused and Rachel saw tears in the young officer's eyes. "My sister was in Philadelphia when it fell. I thought I'd be consumed by hatred, but instead I just feel this overwhelming need to make sure no one else loses their family." "Does that make sense?" Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor of emotion barely contained. "It makes perfect sense, James. That's what separates us from them. The Korvath came here to conquer, to take what isn't theirs. We fight for something deeper, for the people we love, for the world that raised us, for the future we refuse to surrender." Her words were simple, but in that moment they carried the weight of everything humanity had become through this trial by fire. Inside Omega's expanded laboratory, Dr. Benjamin Torres worked alongside his daughter Emma, who had insisted on joining the research team despite being only 17. She had her father's mind for physics and her late mother's courage, a combination that both terrified and filled Benjamin with pride. Together they calibrated the quantum disruption weapon, making adjustments that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Emma's steady hands moved across controls with confidence beyond her years, born from necessity and nurtured by hope. "Dad, what if this doesn't work?" Emma asked quietly, not looking up from her calculations. "What if we fire this weapon and it kills us instead of saving us?" Benjamin stopped his work and turned to face his daughter, seeing in her eyes the same question every person on Earth was asking in different ways. What if hope is not enough? What if courage fails? What if tomorrow never comes? He chose his words carefully, knowing they mattered more than any equation. "Emma, your mother used to say that being human means carrying fear and hope in the same heart. We're terrified, yes, but we're also capable of incredible things when we fight for what matters. This weapon might fail. We might fail. But we have to try because the alternative is accepting defeat without giving everything we have." He smiled gently. "And I've never known a human being who was good at accepting defeat." Professor Yuki Tanaka joined them, her expression showing exhaustion, but also determination. She had been reviewing data from the last Korvath attack, studying the patterns of their assault. "I've discovered something important. The aliens are adapting to our tactics, yes, but they're doing it slowly, methodically. They lack something we have in abundance. The ability to improvise born from desperation. They follow doctrine, we follow instinct. That's our edge and we need to exploit it before they learn." Across the planet, that truth manifested in countless small victories. In the flooded streets of what remained of Amsterdam, a team of engineers used the city's famous canal system to trap and destroy an entire battalion of Korvath ground troops. In the Australian outback, Aboriginal trackers led alien patrols into ambushes using the land itself as a weapon. In Rio de Janeiro, musicians broadcast sound frequencies through the city that disrupted Korvath communications, turning their coordination into chaos. Captain Robert Kane sat in a makeshift briefing room carved from a mountain in the Swiss Alps, surrounded by pilots from every nation. They were planning the largest coordinated strike in human history, an assault on the Korvath command ship that hung in orbit like a dark god. The mission had a 30% survival rate and every pilot had volunteered. Robert looked at faces from China, Nigeria, Brazil, Russia, India, nations that had once viewed each other with suspicion now united by shared purpose. "We know we might not come back," Robert said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "We know the odds are against us. But I think about my son, who's 7 years old and hiding in a shelter right now, and I realize something. He's going to ask me what I did when Earth needed defending. I want to tell him I stood with the bravest people I've ever known and we fought like hell." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. Whatever happens up there, we make it count. We make them remember that humanity doesn't break easy. The room erupted in voices, speaking different languages but sharing one sentiment. Today we fight. Today we show them who we are. Today we earn tomorrow. President Catherine Voss addressed the world from her bunker in Geneva, her face projected on every surviving screen across the planet. She spoke without a script from her heart to billions listening in shelters and ruins. 3 days ago, we faced annihilation. We were caught unprepared, attacked without warning, and many believed this was the end of our story. But I have watched something remarkable happen in these terrible days. I have watched humanity remember what we are capable of when we stand together. She continued, her voice strengthening. We are scientists who turn theories into weapons overnight. We are soldiers who adapt and overcome impossible odds. We are ordinary people who do extraordinary things because someone needs help. The Korvath came here expecting to find a divided world, easy prey, but they found something else entirely. They found a species that refuses to surrender, that fights hardest when cornered, that turns fear into fuel for resistance. In Site Omega, Benjamin received authorization to deploy the quantum disruption weapon. The device was ready, its power cores charged, its targeting systems locked on the Korvath fleet. But before giving the final command, he gathered his team, looking at faces he had worked beside for years and faces he had met only days ago. They were tired, scared, and absolutely unwilling to quit. When we activate this weapon, we change everything, Benjamin said quietly. We either save our world or we make things worse. There's no middle ground, no safe option. But I trust you all, I trust the work we've done, and I trust that whatever happens, we gave humanity its best chance. Emma squeezed his hand. Yuki nodded firmly, and around the room, people straightened their shoulders and prepared to gamble everything on hope and physics. In orbit, Captain Kane's strike force launched from hidden bases, their ships screaming toward the Korvath command vessel. On the ground, armies advanced on alien positions worldwide. In laboratories and bunkers, scientists activated weapons that existed only in imagination days before. Humanity moved as one, every person contributing what they could, from soldiers firing rifles to children sharing rations in shelters. This was the species the Korvath had invaded, and in that moment of unified resistance, Earth burned not with destruction but with defiant light. The quantum disruption weapon fired at precisely 0600 hours Greenwich Mean Time, and for 3 seconds the sky above Earth turned colors that human eyes had never witnessed. Dr. Benjamin Torres held his daughter Emma close as the facility shook, as power conduits screamed with energy beyond their design limits, as the very fabric of space twisted under forces that rewrote the rules of physics. Professor Yuki Tanaka watched her monitors flash warnings in red, then yellow, then impossibly gloriously green. The weapon had worked. In orbit, the Korvath fleet experienced catastrophic system failures across every vessel simultaneously. Their shields collapsed, their weapons went dark, their engines sputtered and died. The quantum disruption wave had torn through their technology like a tsunami through sandcastles, exploiting the very sophistication that made them powerful. Ships that had crossed light years suddenly became helpless metal shells drifting in the void, their crews trapped inside vessels that no longer responded to commands. Captain Robert Kane saw the enemy command ship go dark, just as his strike force entered weapons range. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a trap, some new alien tactic, but then his sensors confirmed what seemed impossible. The Korvath were defenseless. All wings, weapons free, he transmitted, his voice carrying triumph and sorrow mixed together. Make every shot count, make it quick. His squadron opened fire. And across the orbital battlefield, human forces pressed their advantage with precision rather than vengeance. Colonel Rachel Brennan watched the tactical displays update in real time, showing Korvath vessels going offline across the entire fleet. Beside her, Lieutenant Hawthorne was crying and laughing simultaneously, his emotions too large to contain. Colonel, they're broadcasting surrender codes. Multiple alien ships are requesting terms. Rachel felt her knees weaken, felt the weight of 3 days lifting from her shoulders. They had done it. Against impossible odds, against superior technology, humanity had survived. But Rachel understood something that would take the world longer to accept. Survival was not the same as victory, and victory was not the same as peace. She opened a channel to President Voss. Madam President, we have tactical superiority, But we need to decide right now what kind of species we want to be. We can destroy them completely, or we can show them the mercy they never showed us. Her words hung in the air, a question that would define humanity's future. President Catherine Voss stood in her command bunker, surrounded by advisors calling for total annihilation of the Korvath fleet. The voices were loud, angry, demanding justice for 50 million dead, for cities turned to ash, for children who would never grow up. Catherine felt that anger too, felt it burning in her chest like acid. But she also remembered why she had entered public service, remembered the ideals that seemed so distant now yet remained the foundation of everything she believed. "Open a channel to the Korvath command ship," Catherine ordered, her voice cutting through the arguing advisors. When the connection established, she saw the alien commander for the first time. The Korvath leader was wounded, his breathing labored, but his eyes showed something Catherine recognized: fear, the universal constant that connected all thinking beings. "I am President Catherine Voss of Earth. You came to our world expecting easy conquest. You killed millions of our people. You tried to break us." She paused, choosing her next words with care that would echo through history. "But we are not like you. We do not conquer, we do not enslave, we do not destroy without mercy. We offer you one chance. Withdraw from our system. Take your dead and your wounded. Return to your worlds and tell them what happened here. Tell them that Earth is not prey, that humanity will defend itself. But we will not pursue vengeance beyond our borders." The alien commander stared at her, confusion and relief warring across his features. "Why?" the Korvath leader asked, his translator rendering the word in a dozen human languages. "Why show mercy to those who showed you none?" Catherine smiled sadly, thinking of all the speeches about human nature she had given over the years, words that had been tested by fire and somehow survived. "Because mercy is not weakness. It is the hardest form of strength. We spare you not because we cannot destroy you, but because we choose to be better than our worst moments. We choose to build rather than burn, to forgive rather than hate. That is what makes us human." Across Earth, in shelters and ruins, in hospitals and military bases, people watched this exchange on every available screen. Some cried, some raged, some simply sat in stunned silence. The debate would continue for years, decades, generations. Was mercy justice? Did the dead deserve vengeance? Could forgiveness coexist with remembrance? But in that moment, humanity made a choice that would define its place among the stars. Dr. Benjamin Torres powered down the quantum weapon, his hands shaking with exhaustion and relief. Emma hugged him tightly, her young face showing wisdom earned through crisis. "You did it, Dad. You saved everyone." Benjamin shook his head gently. "We did it, Emma. Every person who fought, who helped, who refused to surrender. That's who saved us. I just helped with the science." Professor Yuki Tanaka was already planning the next steps, her mind racing ahead to reconstruction, to learning from Korvath technology, to ensuring Earth would never again be caught unprepared. But she also made a note to take a vacation, to visit her family in Kyoto, to remember that science served life, not the other way around. The balance between preparation and living, between caution and hope, that would be the challenge of the coming years. Captain Robert Kane guided his battered fighter back to Earth, watching the Korvath fleet begin its slow withdrawal from the system. He thought of his son waiting in the shelter, thought of the story he would tell about these 3 days. Not a story of hatred or revenge, but a story of courage and unity, of a world that came together when it mattered most. His son would grow up in a universe that knew about Earth now, that understood humanity was not to be trifled with, but also a universe where mercy remained possible even after horror. Colonel Brennan remained at her post as the all-clear sirens began to sound across the planet. Lieutenant Hawthorne was coordinating relief efforts, his grief for his sister channeled into helping survivors. Rachel watched the sun rise over a wounded world, saw smoke still rising from 100 cities, knew that rebuilding would take decades. But they would rebuild. Humans were remarkably good at that, at taking broken things and making them whole again, at finding hope in ruins. In the weeks that followed, Earth began the long process of recovery. Mass graves for the dead, memorials in every city, therapy for trauma that touched every person alive, but also celebrations. Weddings postponed by war finally taking place, babies born into a world that had survived, children returning to schools built in the rubble. Life reasserted itself with stubborn determination, proving that destruction could wound but not destroy the human spirit. The Korvath kept their word, withdrawing completely and broadcasting warnings to other species about the dangers of attacking Earth. Humanity became known across the galaxy as both fierce defenders and merciful victors, a reputation that opened diplomatic channels even as it deterred aggression. The invasion had changed everything, had revealed technologies and united nations in ways peace never could, but it had also revealed something more important. It revealed that humanity, when tested to its absolute limits, chose not to become monsters. They chose to remain human, with all the complexity that word contained. They mourned their dead while welcoming former enemies to peace talks. They built weapons of terrible power while establishing councils to ensure those weapons served only defense. They remembered the horror while teaching their children about the hope that survived it. Emma Torres stood at her high school graduation 2 years later, giving a speech about the invasion to classmates who had lived through it beside her. "We learned we could fight," she said, her voice carrying across the rebuilt auditorium. "But more importantly, we learned we could choose not to when fighting was no longer necessary. We learned that strength without wisdom is just violence, that survival without compassion is just existence. We learned to be fully, completely, courageously human." Her father watched from the audience, tears streaming down his face, knowing that this was the real victory. Not the weapon he built or the battle they won, but the world that continued, the children who grew up, the future that remained open and bright despite everything. Beside him, Yuki smiled and whispered, "We did good work, Ben. We gave them tomorrow." And tomorrow came, day after day, year after year. Earth healed its wounds and reached for the stars not as conquerors but as explorers, not as destroyers but as builders. The invasion became history, painful but instructive, a reminder of both humanity's vulnerability and its resilience. The Crimson Dawn, when alien ships burned through the atmosphere, became a story told to new generations. A story with a simple moral that never grew old. When tested by fire, humanity did not break. They bent, they adapted, they survived, and most remarkably, they remained kind. They remained human in the best sense of that complicated word. And that, more than any weapon or victory, was the legacy of those 3 terrible, glorious days when Earth stood alone against the dark and refused to fall. The sky was blue again, unmarred by burning ships. Children played in parks replanted over battlefields. Scientists worked in laboratories dedicated to peace rather than war. And somewhere in the vast universe, other species learned a lesson the Korvath paid dearly to teach. That humanity, when pushed to the edge, would fight with everything they had. But when offered the choice between vengeance and mercy, between hatred and hope, they would choose the harder path. They would choose to be better. They would choose to be human.